When we think of the life of Moses in the popular culture, the society in which we live, anyone who's been raised with any kind of a Christian background probably thinks of four stories of this one who was born, Moses in the bulrushes, found in the River Nile. The guy who had the burning bush experience, which is part of the story we're looking at today. The guy who confronted Pharaoh and said, "Let my people go." And then the guy who brought down the Ten Commandments. And that's the sum of most people's perception of who Moses is. And if you've been raised in any kind of a discipleship or a more conservative church, an evangelical church that has gone through the scriptures, you may know more details about some of those stories and be very familiar with the life of Moses. But there is a significant part to these stories that is often misunderstood or not even known that I want to throw some light on today. These stories, having been written by Moses after the fact, are written to the children of Israel as they sit around the foot of Mount Sinai, wandering in the wilderness, which I was surprised to learn, because when I was in Sunday school, I always thought it was like camping, right? So they'd set their tent up for a couple of days, and they'd pack up and they'd move on. No, they probably stood in one or camped in one place for a long time. These are thousands of people. But every once in a while, they would pack up camp and they would move to a different spot in the wilderness. But while they're in that wilderness experience, Moses engages in a process of teaching them who is our God, who is this one who has brought us out of slavery, out of Egypt, and is leading us into the promised land. And the reason they don't go into the promised land immediately is because of their own disobedience. So there's this interlude time, and I think what happens is Moses goes through an orientation session of telling these stories and of documenting it by writing these things that become scripture. But none of this happens in a vacuum. This happens against the backdrop of their interactions and relationships with the other nations around them, and I'm sure there were other nomadic groups that would wander across the desert and eventually find the Israelites and would have some interaction with them. And by the time they do eventually go into the promised land, it's known that these group of nomads exist out in the desert. People know about them. But the influence of 400 years in Egypt had thoroughly saturated their understanding and their perception of life, and especially of who God is, their faith basis, their worldview. So Moses is not simply teaching them some Bible Sunday school type stories. He's giving them a lesson in worldview and in theology one-on-one, who is our God? And part of that is to establish in the context, in that cultural context of 400 years in Egypt and coming out of that, the uniqueness between their God that they believe and we believe is the one true God, creator of heaven and earth, versus the plethora of gods, the polytheistic approach of the Egyptians and of the nations around. So I want to give a little background, historical background, to what the Egyptians believed that helps make this story of Moses and the burning bush and his acceptance of God's mandate to go and lead the people, just gives it three dimensions. In the Egyptian systems of their gods, their polytheistic God, the primary god that they worshipped, his name was Re, and he was the sun god. Now that's just a coincidence, because we think of rays of sunshine as just a coincidence. But the sun god was considered the greatest god. His name was Re. They believed that at sunset, even this most powerful god, when he dipped over the horizon, then had to fight for survival. He became vulnerable until he rose the next day in sunrise. And in that process, in that time between sunset and sunrise, he was chased by dragons and by other gods and fought for his survival. His power when he disappeared at night, was diminished until he rose again the next day. And this cycle went on and on and on endlessly, obviously, because the sun sets and rises every day. Well, there was a goddess named Isis who plotted to gain power over the mighty God. And the one thing that this god Re held that kept him in power over all the other gods, he was the king god, was the secret of his name. Nobody knew what his name was. He had this secret name. They knew he was Re, but he also had a secret name. And so she plotted to figure out what is the secret name of this god. So I, having discovered that secret, can overthrow him and become the powerful, all-powerful queen god instead of being reigned by a king god. In order to deceive him, she crafts a snake out of dirt and lays it on the ground. And it's camouflaged because it looks just like the dirt. And as the sun god travels from the east to the west, he travels over this serpent, this snake made out of dirt, and it reaches up and bites him and infuses him with venom and leaves him in great pain. And he describes that as an eternal fire that burned without end. For the little bit that you may know about the story of Moses and the burning bush, what happens? God reveals his name. Moses is drawn to the fire. Why? Because it never burns out. And how does God convince Moses that he is God? He throws down his staff and it becomes a snake. The elements of the Egyptian culture are used by God to introduce God's people into one who is even greater. And they would have known this myth. 400 years they spent in Egypt as slaves. And elements of those stories are now used by God to repurpose and redescribe in fresh ways. But the one true God, the maker of the sun and the stars, the one who is not vulnerable, the one who is not being chased by lesser gods, he is the one who is telling you, I hear of your suffering, I see your suffering, and I will lead you into the promised land. So as we look at this story of Moses and the burning bush, this isn't just a cute Sunday school story of a miraculous bush that never went out. This is imagery ripped from the Egyptian culture and repurposed to illustrate that you think this God is powerful. Re, this God that we worship, as Moses tells the story to the Hebrews, this God is even greater than that. And let me tell you about this God. Now, is it any wonder that Moses was reluctant to lead his people? He already had a bit of a bad reputation, having killed an Egyptian earlier, and the Hebrews had said, are you going to kill us too? He runs away. We saw this last week. He runs away to Midian. He finds himself a wife there. We see the provision of God and the fingerprints of God in his life. And now a new kind of face-to-face encounter happens, and God uses that to put the children of Israel under Moses' care so he can lead them into the promised land. In Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 and 8, this is a summary concept of the lesson that's being taught by Moses to the Hebrew people, but he puts it in terms of what God says. Exodus chapter 3, verse 7, and the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up. And that's intentional language. That's the poetic beauty of this literature. I have come down, God says, to take them up in order that they may go to a land that is good and broad, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. We'll talk about why all of those nations are listed in just a moment. But here's the summary idea. Unlike the God of Re, who spends his time getting up in the morning, running across the sky and setting, and then at night being vulnerable to a dragon that chases him. And there are other gods plotting against him, trying to find his secret and trying to kill him. And he spends all his time in self-preservation mode. The God of the Hebrews sees the people he has created, and he cares for them, and he hears their groaning, and he has come down in order to take them up and to move them into the promised land. This is a God who is relational, who is caring for his creation, not a God that we make stories up and, oh, well, how do we explain the sun rising and the sun setting? Well, I've got a great idea. Let's call him Gray, and let's have this. And all these stories begin to propagate, and the most popular stories make it to the top, and people begin to worship the creation instead of the creator. And the God that Moses is trying to introduce to the children of Israel is radically different because he is relational. He is not at threat, but rather he is seeking to care for his people. Now this, like the other stories in the book of Exodus, and again, when I use the word story, I'm using it in the sense that it's literature. It is carefully crafted. It has the components of literature. It's written in a style so that it's easy to remember and to recite to one another as they tell these stories back and forth. So to help us track through this story and to see the big picture, let me share with you how this story is crafted by Moses. It opens with an unanticipated meeting with Moses and God at the burning bush. It closes with an unanticipated meeting with Moses and his father-in-law, and Moses saying, I need your blessing in order to go back and do what God told me to do. So the story opens with a meeting and a discussion, the first one between Moses and God, and the last one, the closing, between Moses and his father-in-law. In between that, God makes some speeches. The first speech that God makes, he says, this is holy ground. And Moses notes that he is at the foot of Mount Horeb. Mount Horeb is another way of saying Mount Sinai. The foreshadowing here is pretty impressive. And God says, this is holy ground. That's his first speech. In his second speech, God says, I am the God over all things. And then in his third speech, he says, I am going to help you, but you must obey me and be loyal to me. In between that, we have some dialogue between God and Moses. And God does most of the speaking, but Moses asks some question. The first question Moses asks is, who am I that you would want me to do this? And God's first answer is, don't worry about who you are, worry about who I am, because I will be with you and you will worship me. So Moses says, okay, then who are you? And then we got that great statement, I am that I am. Then God gives that second speech about being God over all things. And then there's this dialogue of doubt. And despite all of that, Moses says, what if? And God does some amazing things with the snake. He throws down his staff, and it becomes a snake, and he picks it up and becomes a staff again, which, by the way, when I was in Sunday school, this story confused me, because the only staff I knew was a secretary. And I couldn't figure out, how did Moses have a secretary, and why was he throwing her on the ground and then she became a snake? Until I realized it was like a pole, right? So we're not talking about a human resources kind of staff here. We're talking about a shepherd's staff. But seriously, that confused me as a kid. Why is he throwing his staff on the ground? And then he takes his hand, he puts it inside his cloak, and it turns leprous. He pulls it out, and it's whole, or he puts it back in again, and it's whole again. So that's the general structure. And for the sake of time, we're just going to hit some highlights through this. But the whole point drives to the messages God is giving Moses so he can tell the children of Israel, this is the God, and we know his name. The most powerful king, God, of the Egyptians and their religious system. His key to power was this secret name. And yet Moses learns the name of the Creator God, the I Am. So let's start with this unexpected meeting. Follow along. I'm just going to pull out a few verses here and there. I encourage you to read this in the larger context, but we don't have 3 hours to do all that, so we're going to try and condense it a little bit. So verses 1 to 4 is this unanticipated meeting between God and Moses at the burning bush at Mount Sinai. Verse 1, chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Here's one of those literary elements, anticipation. He comes to the mountain, he doesn't know it's the mountain of God, but that's where he goes. He goes to the mountain of God. Eventually, what's going to happen there? He's going to go up that mountain, later called Sinai, and come down with the law. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. I love the fact that Moses, as he records this, puts in his thought process. Well, that's odd. What's going on here? I got to check it out. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called out to him. Just think about that for a moment. That God was watching Moses' interaction with this burning bush, and when the time was right, and Moses is doing whatever, he goes, well, that's kind of odd. He must have looked at it for a while to know the fire was not being consumed. I got to check this out. What kind of wood is that? Imagine if I could market that. Right? Wouldn't that be amazing? Here's the wood that never goes out. I could say, no, not a good idea because nobody would buy my wood again. Who knows what kind of thoughts were going through Moses' head. But he was fascinated by this, so he turns to check it out, and God is watching him. Such an obscure little thing. And yet God is watching him. And that's part of the lesson that Moses is trying to teach these Hebrew refugees, that God's eyes are on you. He is caring for you. And so when he turns, God called to him. This deity is revealing himself to Moses. Again, totally out of character for the gods of Egypt. You had no idea what those gods wanted. Maybe I should offer this sacrifice. It'll make them happy. Maybe I should offer this sacrifice. It was always trial and error, and you never knew what the gods wanted. But this God reveals himself. He calls to Moses, and he says, Moses. And Moses says, here I am. What else are you going to say? So God begins this speech then in verses 5 and 10 and addresses some of what will be core issues in Moses' interaction with him. Starting in verse 5. He said, do not come near. Take sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And we're going to learn later, like in Psalm 24, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. But beginning this anticipation of at the foot of Mount Sinai, there's something special. And he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, and he was afraid to look at God. He understood, he knew the stories of their legacy, their heritage, and he suddenly understood that this is the God, and he was intimidated. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings. God sees, and God knows, and yet it was still going to be months. I don't know how much time took place between this encounter and the Hebrews actually leaving Egypt and crossing the Red Sea. I have no idea how much time that was. But it was a considerable amount of time. Yet God's plan for addressing that issue would take time to unfold. We think through our own reality and we pray and we want God to fix stuff and we want him to fix it now and make it go away. God's timing for resolving those things often means delay because, well, he's got other purposes. We have to remember that. He goes on, verse 8, I have come down, this engagement of God, to deliver them out of the hands of the Egyptians, to bring them up to that land, that good and broad land, land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I've also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Egypt, out of Egypt, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Wow, God, you want me to do what? Are you certain about this? Now notice how it's repeated over and over again. The God of your father, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob. Throughout this story, we're going to see that. Why? Because Moses is reminding the Israelites of the faithfulness of God to the promises made originally to Abraham and of the continuity that they have, that they are in this special relationship with God. But he also mentions at length over and over again the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, because God is expressing his authority over all the nations. And these are the nations that they would eventually be going into battle against when they go into the promised land. So God is not just the God of the Hebrews and isn't just looking at Moses, but all of those Hebrews that are tied back to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God has been watching them. And the Egyptians and these other nations around, God is aware of them too. And God is greater, God is global compared to the gods of the other nations. Now here's another cultural dynamic that we may gloss over, we may not be aware of, but was very much a part of the Hebrew thinking and the Egyptian thinking, that the gods were local gods. So the Egyptians had their set of gods. And the Jebusites would have their sets of gods, and the Hittites would have their sets of gods. And often there was overlap in some of their understanding, but gods were local. And each family would have their gods. And so the idea of a god was that this is like the one that I want, the one I want to curry favor with, the one I'm choosing, rather than the God who is the God over all other small g gods, who now is turning his attention to this very specific group of people who has chosen them. The global nature, the universal nature, the idea that God is the creator God, that just was beyond their understanding of what a God could be. This is a personal God, a relational God. And we see this in verse 10. Come, and I will send you. Have a relationship with me. This is an invitation to a journey. I will send you and I will be with you. So now we come to some questions. In verse 11, Moses asks his first question. Who am I to do this? Are you really sure? In verse 12, God provides an answer. He said, I will be with you. And this will be the sign for you that I have sent you when you have brought out the people out of Egypt. You shall serve me on this mountain. Okay, God, that's great, but you know what? I'd prefer another sign. Could you do something like write it in the stars? Could you do something amazing? It's like, no, here's the sign I'm going to give you that you will worship me. That doesn't seem like much of a sign, but it implies this relationship, this ongoing knowledge of who God is, and to serve and worship him, they must learn who he is and how to relate to him. So there's a lot bundled in that simple phrase, you shall serve this God on the mountain. That word serve then becomes the root word that's used throughout the Psalms of to worship God. Verse 13, Moses asks a second question. Well, if they ask me, who sent me, what's your name? Remember the cultural background for that. God answers in verse 13. Then Moses said to God, if I were to come to people of Israel and say to them, the God of the Father sent me, and they're going to say, what's his name? Of course they want to know the name of God. That was the Egyptian mystery. That was the great riddle. What is the name, the hidden name of Ray? God said to Moses, I am who I am. I am the self-existing God. I am the eternal God. I am the one that is like no other. I alone am God. All of that bundled into that simple phrase, I am who I am. And say this to the people of Israel, the I am has sent me to you. So there's a second speech now, verses 15 to 22. And again, we're just going to go through this for the sake of time. Verse 15, God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel. The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. So time is not an issue for this God. The gods of Egypt, they would come and go based on, the top 40 most popular gods, and it was always changing. But the God of Israel is always God throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt, and I promise to bring you out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. I'm the God who's over all of this, and I am the universal God with global authority over the nations. An understanding, a perception of God radically different than what they had learned for 400 years of slavery in Egypt, in that polytheistic system that they had lived under. So now there's this dialogue between Moses and God because Moses is full of doubt. He says, they're not going to believe me. And God says, okay, let me give you a couple of signs. What's that in your hand? It's a staff, not a secretary, a piece of stick. Throw it down, becomes a snake. Pick it up, becomes a staff. Pretty amazing. I'm glad, it says, it's funny if you read the text, that Moses ran away. Well, yeah, I would too. If I had a stick and I threw it down and it became a snake, I'd be running away too. Had a huge fear of snakes until we went to Ecuador. Now I've got a huger fear of snakes. He says, okay, that's nice, but, okay, Moses, one more. Stick your hand in your coat. Now take it out. Oh, no, look, I've got leprosy. Put it back in. Take it out. Oh, look, I've been healed. Amazing supernatural interventions by God, demonstrating his authority over all things. And yet Moses still has doubts. In fact, he comes back and he says, verse 10, but Moses said to the Lord, oh, my Lord, different word. Moses said to Yahweh, oh, my Adonai, just recognizing him as, a powerful master. I am not eloquent, either in the past or since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. And we can all relate to that. Number one fear most people have, public speaking. You don't want to have to stand. Now there are some of us who God's gifted the gift of the gab, and we love to stand up and natter on. Sorry about that. But for most people, that public speaking is intimidating. And Moses says, well, I can't. I get tongue-tied. And essentially, he's downgrading the authority of God, Yahweh, as being the God of all things, because he says to him, okay, Yahweh, here's the problem, Master. And he doesn't even use that name for God. So Moses receives a personal lesson in theology from God himself. And here's part of the core of this story. Verse 11, the Lord said to him, who has made man's mouth? Who has made it? Who's the creator who intentionally designed each person to be exactly the way they are? Who has made him mute or deaf or seeing or blind? And in the mindset we've seen this in the day of Jesus, in the mindset of the ancient peoples, those things demonstrated the gods were angry with you or angry with your parents, that you should be afflicted with some kind of deformity or discapacity or whatever you perceived it to be. But God says, I am the Lord over all those things. And then he goes on, he says, I'm going to help you. I'll provide a helper. His name's Aaron, your brother. He'll help you. But don't forget, Moses, who created the scenario? I did. I have authority over all things. And in spite of that, And because Moses is resistant, God, in giving him this help, is not the happiest with Moses. Verse 14, then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, is there not Aaron, your brother, the Levite? I know that he can speak well. Behold, he's coming out to meet you, and when he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. You shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and teach both of you of what to say. You shall speak he shall speak for you to the people, and he shall be your mouth, and you shall be as God to him. And take in your hand this staff, and with it you shall do the signs. So Moses, what are you worried about? I am going to prepare you and give you everything you need to fulfill this amazing, overwhelming task with which I'm charging you. Before we throw Moses under the bus for coming up with excuses and for his lack of faith, we have to remember that even though he saw miracles, he, like us, seldom are convinced by the supernatural. It is our heart and our mind that the Spirit of God works in to draw us to himself, and we can do all kinds and observe all kinds of things, and people do, and yet they fail to respond to God. Because a relationship with God is not based on experience, but is based on the Spirit of God working in our hearts, in our minds. Living by faith is a choice we make with our minds. And we choose to serve the living God. And we choose to be loyal to him in spite of what we may see in his providence and his care for us. And until we are convinced about what God is and who he is, we will never be able to fully embrace what it is to worship and to be loyal to him. So the story closes out then with another unanticipated meeting where Moses now, maybe reluctantly, we don't know, he goes to Jethro and he says, I need to take my family and head back to Egypt. And just think about that for a moment. Sharon and I put our parents through this. Dad, Mom, we think God wants us to go to Ecuador. Great. Wait. For how long? With the grandchildren. Where did you say? And it was as much of a struggle, maybe even more of a struggle, for our parents to let us go than for Sharon and I to pack up and actually go. And I've never fully appreciated that until now I'm on this side of parenting and my kids have moved out. And I realize, wow, how hard was it for my parents to say goodbye to me? Well, Moses goes to Jethro, and Jethro says, yep, go in peace. And then in verse 19, and the Lord said to Moses and Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who were seeking your life are dead. So Moses took his wife and his sons, had them ride on a donkey. They went back to the land of Egypt, and Moses took the staff of God in his hand. When God provides, and we'll look at the rest of the story next week as Moses confronts Pharaoh. But the whole point of this story is that God, before Moses goes toe-to-toe with Pharaoh and addresses the necessity for him to let God's people go, God spends a chunk of time face-to-face with Moses. And that intimacy of revealing himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who is over all the nations, the universal God, and using the elements that came from the very Egyptian mythology and demonstrating his own superiority over all those things. In fact, I will tell you my name. My name is I Am. The character of God. I know I say this over and over and over again, but we have to always remind ourselves, because this is, if you want to talk about culture wars, this is where culture wars in the 21st century is being battled. Understanding the character of God, that life is lived in his presence. He is engaged, he does see, he is aware. And as much as our hearts may be grieved by some of the stuff happening in our culture, God is not unaware nor taken by surprise. He doesn't wander off at sunset and come back at sunrise. In those nights where, as the psalmist says, our pillows are filled with tears, he is aware of what is happening in his creation. And as much as he turned his attention to Moses at the burning bush and called out to him, so also his attention is turned to us. This is the character of God. This is the God we worship. And as we engage with our culture and society, we must always come back to this reference point, that God is relational and knowable and engaged and continues to hold authority over all he has created. And life is lived in his presence. We are not disheartened by the trends and all of the social and cultural movements that we see that do not align with the character and nature and values and morals and ethics of the kingdom of God. But that's okay, because they didn't for the Hebrews either in Egypt. And yet God saw. But he didn't fix it right away. There was a delay. Yet Moses is trying to help God's people just not find the solution to the problem, but focus on who this God is. What is his nature and character? And although we're going to go through a tough process, remember, he is God, unlike the gods of the nations around. The second lesson that Moses is prepping these people for is how to approach God and not just know about God. In fact, the entire Old Testament law, those really horrible, boring parts like Leviticus and Deuteronomy, they're lessons in how to approach God. It's lessons in relationship, not just rituals and rules to be followed, but how do we approach God and not just know about him? We remember his holiness. We remember his eternality. We remember that he is to be served and worshiped, and Moses puts that little foreshadowing there, and we'll develop it further later on in the story. But again, verse 12 of chapter 3, I will be with you, and this will be the sign for you, that I have sent you. When you brought the peoples out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. It's about the relationship. And Moses is trying to help these people rethink and re-understand, or to learn maybe for the first time, that their God, the God we worship today, is radically different from the cultural perceptions of what God is and how God works. The biggest thing that these Hebrew slaves about to be led into the promised land needed to learn is that life is lived in the presence of God. He saw Moses, he called to Moses. He engaged with Moses. He revealed himself to Moses. He was not intimidated by a snake or a dragon chasing him. He did not become vulnerable at sunset until sunrise, but rather this is a God, not just a superpower, but a personal, creator, relational, and knowable God before whom we live, and who is observing and sees the injustices and calls us both to holiness and loyalty and to confidence and trust, because he sees, he knows, and ultimately he will correct and bring righteousness.